Hello, dear listeners of the podcast In Search of Meaning. The final episode of the first season is on the air. Evgeny Golub and political philosopher Pavel Shchelin are at the microphone. Hello. Today, we have chosen two topics for conversation, after which we will talk about our plans for the future. The first topic will be the relationship of the citizen and the state. We decided to talk about this in connection with the latest events, the events of the last more than a year. We will talk about universal military duty. Where did it come from? Why does it raise so many questions today? And how should we treat it if we try to treat everything sensibly? Pavel, what is the history of the emergence of universal military service? But in the modern form, we owe this to the Great French Revolution, although the great can probably be taken in quotation marks. Although the consequences are really great, it is then that the young state comes up with a new fundamentally way of relating man and the state, and at the same time, but also a way of recruiting its army with the help of mass conscription. It's called in French. The main idea was that since all citizens of this state are endowed with political subjectivity, that is, accordingly, the duty to die for this state also becomes universal. In the era that preceded the Great French Revolution, there was still a separation of fundamental responsibilities and subjectivities. Subjectivity was not supposed to be equal for every person. It differed depending on your class, depending on your position in society, and depending on your duty. That is, there was a fighting class, there was a working class, there was a praying class. The rest of the army was completed at the expense of recruitment kits, which also still implied an intellectual choice. Yes, in the context of, for example, the Russian Empire, recruitment was not a particularly voluntary event, but it was very limited. And in Europe, even this very recruitment, albeit often with the help of deception, assumed a voluntary decision of a person to sign a contract with a recruiter. There are several well-known fan tulip films, and there, at the very initial prices, it is simply presented very well. It will be interesting to see how it was before the French Revolution. But with the Great French Revolution, fundamental changes are taking place, namely, the state suddenly gets the opportunity to form really large armies which no recruitment system could reproduce. And it's just that the French Republic has gained a huge numerical advantage. This is to the question of how France could fight against the whole of Europe. That is precisely why, in other words, it could mobilize many times more people than any other European state. I have two big questions. And the first question is that France called itself a republic, apparently referring us to the past of the great Roman Republic. And if we look further into the past, what about the Romans? After all, it was the duty of a Roman citizen to defend the Republic. What was the difference then? Well, look, if we talk about the Roman Republic itself then, that is, if the peculiarity of a Roman citizen of the Republic era was that serving in the army was essentially a privilege. It wasn't even just a duty, it was a privilege. That is, if you remember, there is a well-known British true poem, in which the Roman one is well expressed, however, that there is no honor in death, not that you take cats for the land of your forefathers, for the temple of your gods. That is, this is Roman, this is with Roman logic, which really assumed military service as a sacred duty of a Roman citizen. But in fact, by the end of the Republican period, this system is changing, and the legions begin to form according to different principles. This is especially happening already in fact in the era of civil wars, that is, already in the era of the great civil wars of Rome. These legionnaires in fact cease to be citizens who have joined the military service at the call of the state, but rather become professional soldiers with the aim of greater efficiency, who serve all their lives. Well, and later in the time of the Roman Empire, this system remains so. In other words, a soldier is a lifelong job, it's a professional job. And later they mostly began to take mercenaries for this service, because the Romans themselves refused to serve in the army. For them, there was much more of a more enjoyable pastime. All sorts of Germans mostly came to this service. That is, the Germans were simply given weapons and later these Germans staged a coup. In general, a very funny and interesting story began. In the Roman Republic, if I understand correctly, at the beginning of the Republic, military service was an honorable duty, a privilege, and it was voluntary. It's kind of voluntary, but you can't refuse, as far as I remember. In other words, you couldn't just say no. That is, if Rome has gathered a legion, then you are going to this legion. In other words, it was still important. Therefore, for example, after the Battle of Cannae, the Romans could restore these legions. In other words, there was a problem rather in the capacity and economic ability to provide these very legions. But it was during the Republic that it was impossible to simply refuse this debt, if my memory serves me correctly. correctly. Although maybe I will be wrong. Well, at the level of ethics of society, it is definitely impossible. Well, the borders of Rome were not closed. They were not forbidden to leave the Republic. If you suddenly did not want to serve in the Legion, well, then it was very difficult to close the borders at all, just for technical reasons. In Greece, in the Athenian Republic, Socrates fought. In the Athenian democracy, yes. Political subjectivity is directly proportional to the ability to perform military service. Yes. In other words, in principle, the French simply applied the same principle, but on a new historical turn. In other words, they did not invent anything new. They adapted well-known stories to that time and gained a great numerical advantage in the armed forces. Yes. And what's next? And then everyone started copying this system, because it's like an arms race. If your opponent has such a weapon, you will have to copy it. And a lot of interesting social processes began. One of them was the phenomenon so familiar to our listeners as mass school education. If you think that mass school education was created in order to teach people knowledge out of love for knowledge, then you are deeply mistaken. The theorist of the modern school education system, well, in its bulk it was Fichte, in the speech of the German nation, directly formulated that after the crushing defeat that Elbrus suffered from the French, we need to create a new system that will never allow this repetition. And the school has become the main tool of this system. At school, the child had to learn several things, namely life in a team in the future, consider it a platoon. Obedience to an officer, the teacher not to ask unnecessary questions, and the main discipline. And then, when this student enters the battlefield, he does not run under a hail of bullets, but stands and obediently executes commands, instructions, and orders. That's actually what the school education system was created for. She coped with this task very successfully. Bismarck did not deceive at all that it was a Prussian school teacher who won the war of 1871. In other words, he was absolutely right here. And again, other countries just started gradually copying this system. Of course, I have doubts whether it is only for the purpose of forming an army. Well, including this one. But if from the point of view of the state, it was actually one of the main tasks. I would say that such obedience and discipline, and the ability to live and cooperate in a team with the development of industries, with the complication of life in the state, it was needed not only in the army. The civil service and administrative apparatus also needed the same skills. I agree, this can be considered an addition. It so happened that the whole society began to change. These skills would have been extremely in demand, but initially this army component was extremely important. In other words, it's not just, coincidentally. In general, the state does not like to invest money in something unless it is connected with the war. What came to my mind? After all, to demand a willingness to sacrifice oneself, to sacrifice one's life in general, is the ultimate sacrifice of a person. It is the ultimate gift. When we talked a little about other things, we said that the maximum that a person can give to a loved one is his life. There is nothing more she can give. There is no greater love than the one who will lay down his own for each other. And it turns out that the state demands this gift, this ultimate sacrifice. And in exchange, what does it provide in exchange? Or maybe it creates this illusion. But here comes the real problem, that according to the idea in this system, in exchange, a citizen receives political subjectivity. That is, the notorious vote in elections. That is, the opportunity to theoretically influence the government with his voice. In other words, this is the main promise. At the symbol level and at the structure level, this is the main prize, this is the main reward. And now I'm going to try to promote my idea here, because it seems to me, few people can be persuaded to die for political rights. And if you make a choice, you know what, buddy, let's do this. If you want to have political rights, be ready to die. But I think a person will think very hard and say, I'm probably not sure that I want this. But if you cultivate a person's love for something beautiful, big, parental, eternal, then yes. Then it seems ethically justified to die for it, and then you can love it. And here we turn to the second topic, the topic of nationalism and the topic of human involvement in something more. We talked outside of this issue about the fact that I am personally surprised at how important it is for people to belong to some group, and how this group, whether it's a team, whether it's fans of some team or a street gang, becomes a value, sometimes a super value. When we talk about the state, about what they began to call a nation, they're 200 years ago, then this is super valuable. Something that is supposed to be loved, well, for the sake of it, they can probably already demand this ultimate sacrifice. Do you see any connection between the growth or emergence of nation-states, mass mobilization, and propaganda calls to die for the fatherland, which very often hides the state, the powerful, the elites, who, in principle, are not really ready to share either power or resources, but they will demand the ultimate sacrifices. But here you are absolutely right. And here it's not even a matter of what I see or what you see, but it's just a well-known historical fact, again, explored inside and out. And going back to the school system, the second important component for which the school was needed was precisely for the creation of nation-states. In other words, it was at school that these nation-states were, in fact, created, and by an absolutely violent method. I'm not even going to give an example of any potentially offensive cases here. Or we can take France. Yes, exactly. France is considered a classic example. It was through the school system that the enormous complexity of regional French identities was destroyed, and, in fact, a single French identity system was created. In other words, it's all a direct relationship of this experiment of the 19th century. A nation, a massive army, a massive school education. Well, you can even say you're right. The beginning of a mass economy, like this industrial revolution, that is, in fact, the appearance of the masses on the stage and the transformation of this mass into the main tool of this collectivity. Here you are right, there is a substitution, that it is such a mass that begins to be thought of as the main way of this very collectivity. Because this was preceded by a much more complex pattern of collectivity in the Middle Ages. That is, I was a collective there as a citizen, as a member of the workshop, as believers, these are my separate ones. These were all different collectives on slime against each other, and they were all important in their own way, and it cannot be said that one of them always necessarily dominated the other. In other words, it was a much more complex system. And these identities, they were to some extent, if I can say so, more real, because you knew the members of your parish, these people. You had personal obligations to them. The workshops in the village were your own, even the cities were small, right? Yes, absolutely. And after the era of mass participation in everything, from education to the army, it was impossible to physically know everyone who belonged to this super large group. This is exclusively what is called an imaginary community. In other words, it all exists exclusively in the imagination, ontologically, and it is impersonal. You're absolutely right here. If the previous system was based on personal relationships first of all, then the new system has become impersonal. But in exchange, I repeat what you said, how would you get these powerful political, social, and other rights? Sort of. Here is a kind of exchange. I want to conclude the discussion on this topic. It is, of course, huge, but sometimes I sincerely feel sorry and painfully sorry for those people who are emotionally involved in the experience of an imaginary community, which in many ways is man-made, can be created by someone for purposes far from the purpose and interests of a particular person. But this joining, sticking, belonging to this imaginary community, it leads to real tragedies, the breakdown of life, to victims. And apparently now it's time to move on to what we're going to talk about in the second season. We're going to talk about identity issues. How do you see the discussion of this topic? As I will see, we will find out in the second season, if we talk in more detail here. But I would say, why did it seem important to us, and why did we decide to make it the central nodal point of our entire second season? Because it's a recurring theme. That is, if anyone does not know, I remind you that we have made a chat where we communicate with our dear listeners, dear subscribers. And for me, this is also the space in which I am. Well, a kind of slice, if you like, according to which I can track many things, and I can notice topics that are repeated. It is clear that one of the biggest problems is confusion, while there is a huge demand for something to think about and sort out. This is the problem of identity, the problem of the name, the problem of what it means to be someone. why it is important to be someone, how it relates to other areas of life. And this is really a very difficult problem. These are not the most obvious things. That's the whole point. The fact that the philosophical base, if you will, the philosophical semantic foundation, is clearly lacking in these matters, especially in a simple, understandable language, and therefore I think this, first of all, will be a fruitful direction for you and me to sort out for ourselves. In the end, in many ways we do these podcasts because we ourselves are trying to sort out important things for us, but I think it will be extremely useful for listeners as well. And this is really one of the fundamental nodal themes of political philosophy as such. What is a name? What responsibilities it imposes, if you will, on a person, whether our words reflect reality, or in what way reality is present in our words. The same can be applied to identity. Does identity reflect reality, or is reality present in identity? Is identity pure imagination? In other words, we have said, for example, now about the Nazis, that this is an imaginary community, but I would say that this is only one of the facets. In fact, it's really an imaginary community. Not only that, there are many other important facets there, which again also rest on these philosophical problems of identity, what it is, how it functions in society. I think that what we see in the process is a deeper discussion of the problems of symbolic thinking, which is fundamentally important for the traditionalist agenda, which we have already talked about this season in previous issues. So yes, I formulated in general, what he revealed here is a rather unpowered field in modern public discussion in Russian. Well, let's try to plow this plot, as they say. Can I say that we will try with you to question, or help a person to ask the question first of all to himself, and who am I? And why do I consider myself to be such? You can, yes, you can. What is the basis of my worldview, my views? To what extent are these my views? To what extent can I defend them? To what extent are they justified for myself? And if not, why do I take them on faith? And it may be easy to agree that some part of our worldview is axioms, or accepted values and concepts, that we have absorbed from the context in which we have lived or are living. I guess that's how I'm going to try to say something in my own way. I would agree that this is also, that is, it is a more special case, I think, of what we are going to say. That is, I will say right away that the style is clear. We are not going to deconstruct for the sake of deconstruction, as postmodernists like it. But first we will have to describe what is, that is, I can first pursue in principle how it works in theory and reality, and then, accordingly, how it relates to each individual person. And this, I repeat, is a very large set of issues that we will actually form in the process. In other words, we have just the summer for this. I also want to add that, of course, our next season will not be limited to such complex topics in a sense. We promise to continue to respond sometimes to interesting topical cultural phenomena that allow us to talk about something complicated, as it has already been this season, and, as we noticed, what remains very important and very sensitive for our esteemed listeners. For our esteemed viewers, we can say, okay, then in conclusion, I will invite everyone who listens to us to join the discussion chat. If for some reason you are uncomfortable or do not want to participate in discussions, there is a group of authors' wishes. We are carefully studying and will be ready to answer your questions during podcasts or answer directly in the text of the chat. Yes, we also mention that in the same chat, we will post information about our online audience meetings. Many things are best discussed, but if not eye to eye, then camera to camera is there and eyes to camera. Therefore, we once again invite you to our field of communication and see you or hear from you soon. In the fall, in the podcast format, but don't switch, there will be other formats, so everything will be fine. Thank you, friends. See you later. See you later.